talking about influence on writers can be misleading because you don't necessarily write like the writers who influence you. One of the first was Alan Ayckbourn, who I studied really for the way he constructed his plays. He was a master constructor. I've got a lot of his plays, only one first edition, and I've put in one of the letters that he wrote me in 1984-5. I went up to Scarborough to perform in a musical which he directed called His Monkey Wife, based on a rather odd 1930s book by John Collier. And when I was leaving after having done His Monkey Wife, Alan, who knew that I was a playwright, said, write me a play for next season. So somehow I did, and it was one of those really rare occasions. I sent it to him, and literally by return of post I had a letter from him saying I'd like to put it in my next summer season. And this was the play I wrote, and it's the first published book I had, called Imaginary Lines. I wouldn't call myself a collector exactly, more an accumulator, but one of the things I do love to collect is old theatrical magazines, particularly copies of the play Pictorial. I think they're absolutely fascinating because they give you an impression of the changing tastes of people, especially in the theatre and in literature in general. And if you look back, I've got quite a lot of early ones from the 1900s. This particular bound volume is from 1908. Each play Pictorial magazine concentrates on one play, and they give you photographs and captions of dialogue, so you get a very good impression of the play that it was. And very often they're plays you simply wouldn't want to go and see, but they're fascinating to have a glimpse of. This one in particular is called The Christian. It's by Hall Caine, a once very famous writer, now almost completely forgotten. Here's a picture of Hall Caine. Some people think that he had a passionate homosexual affair with Jack the Ripper, and if you look at this photograph, he has a rather haunted expression on him, and you can well imagine that he might have had an affair with Jack the Ripper. Here's a few scenes from it, in particular this very dramatic one of a clergyman trying to strangle the heroine, whose name was Gloria Quayle, and he says, "God sent me to kill you, Glory," and but he doesn't kill her. So, because on the other page you can see, "No, but to love me, kiss me, John." So it's a remarkable scene. Hall Caine was a remarkable man, very popular in his day. Lenin and Gorky were very fond of Hall Caine, but he's completely forgotten because he was a moralizing bore. In terms of literary influences, I suppose Dickens was an early passion, and in fact when I was about 11 or 12 I saved up some pocket money and went with my mother to the second-hand department of foils because I was determined to buy a complete set of Dickens, which I did, and it's this one here, and it's the centenary edition. In other words, it's exactly 100 years old because it was produced in 1912. It's nice clear print, and it doesn't have the original illustrations. It has illustrations by an artist called Harry Furniss, who I think is rather good. Here's a picture of him, of Steerforth meeting little Emily for the first time. You can see there's a certain 1890s languor about the pose of Steerforth, but that's appropriate. Okay. One of my proudest possessions is something that I never collected myself. It was bought by my father, and it's a complete set, original set of the Yellow Book from April 1894 to 1897. And my father was captured at Singapore in 1942 and spent 2 ghastly years as a prisoner of war of the Japanese on the infamous Railway of Death, and he was a writer and a journalist, and when he came back from the war he decided to buy himself a present. So he went to an antiquarian bookseller in Piccadilly and saw a complete set of the Yellow Book, which he bought. And here we are in pencil. We have 13 volumes, 10 guineas, which is £10.50. I don't know what that is in dollars, about $17 I should think. Not very much. And over the years I've dipped into this book. It was really remarkable, partly of course because of the design of it, black and yellow, very smart indeed, with Aubrey Beardsley as the artistic director of it, so to speak. But it contained all the main writers of the 90s, as you can see from the contents. It starts off with a story by Henry James, the first volume. Then there's a story by Richard Le Gallienne, one of the stalwarts of the 1890s, and with Henry Harland, a very regular contributor to the Yellow Book. And then there's A Defence of Cosmetics by Max Beerbohm. And this was actually, in the first book of the Yellow Book, this was his first published piece of work, and he wrote it while he was still an undergraduate at Oxford in 1894. And it caused a bit of a stir, you know, a young man defending cosmetics. This is very unhealthy indeed. Unwholesome, sir, as they would have said. Then there's a poem by A.C. Benson, a writer who, apart from his diaries, is always rather disappointing. And there are a great many wonderful illustrations too, by Walter Richard Sickert and other notables of that day, and of course by Aubrey Beardsley. And in fact, when I was doing my third collection, I decided that I would use black and yellow as a cover design for Masks of Satan, and Ash Tree allowed me to design a pastiche Aubrey Beardsley for the front cover. If you're researching into something to write about a particular period, it's very good to look at bound volumes of magazines, particularly Punch, which illustrates the humour of the time. I've got a rather random selection, some from 1962, which I collected and had bound myself, and then a complete set from the 1914-18 war, which is absolutely fascinating. And that, I think, was the time when the actual quality of the drawing, if not the humour, was at its very best. Particularly the political cartoons by a man called Bernard Partridge, who was a wonderfully vigorous draftsman. And here's one I particularly like, done in 1918, of the Kaiser in his hour of defeat. The sands run out. It's a wonderfully vigorous piece of drawing, very melodramatic, but the interesting thing is, I think, that it gives the Kaiser a certain kind of dignity about him. And you see the hourglass has the word militarism on it, just in case you didn't realise what the cartoon was about. I also collected one or two Punch cartoons, and I had them framed and hung up on the wall. And there's one I particularly like up here. This is by an artist called Louis Boehmer, who was a very popular Punch cartoonist, and as you can see, an extremely accomplished draftsman. And the caption, which is rather faint in pencil, the maid is saying to this rather sedate couple, "I'm just going to wash me hair, mum, so if anyone should call, I'm hout." And I rather like it because, contrary to what some people say, Punch cartoons weren't always on the side of the upper classes. I think that this is making fun just as much of this rather pompous, sedate, middle-aged, middle-class couple as it is of the pert servant girl. As I said, I'm really not a collector. I'm more of an accumulator, and to a certain extent an inheritor. And I inherited all my aunt's books, some of which are here, the most nicely bound of them, nearly all are hers. There's a lot of poetry, and here's a bound volume of her poems. Before she wrote Cold Comfort Farm, which made her famous, rather like Byron, almost overnight, she was also quite well known as a poet, very much in the Georgian mode. Her main influence was Walter de la Mare, and she was, in her way, a very fine poet. I'd just like to read one poem, which was the poem, actually, that I read at her funeral. This is from 1936, and the interesting thing about it is that it's very prophetic of her own life, because in spite of being 5 years older than her husband Alan, she survived him by 30 years. He died of cancer in 1959. And this is a poem that she wrote in 1936. It's just called Song. Soft but clearly as sweethearts tolls the passing bell through this haunted heaven where we have to dwell. Therefore, friends and husband, love we well. Where the open flower dances by her leaf, through the fullest hour blows the breath of grief. Warning child and mother, life is brief. Child and friend and husband, hear the warning sigh. Beauty ends in sorrow, one of us must die, and one of us must watch a coffin passing by. If love could choose, the watcher should be I. And indeed, it was her. It's a very beautiful poem, and she was admired by the likes of, as a poet, by the likes of Virginia Woolf and T.S. Eliot, who published her in his magazine Criterion. But there are also lots of other books. I do like reading her books because in many of them she writes her own marginal comments, and it sounds rather fanciful, but it is really rather like hearing a voice from the dead. She was particularly fond of the varieties of religious experience by William James. We shared a mutual interest in anything to do with religion, spirituality, mysticism, and so on. And some of her comments are very serious, but some of them are very funny. And what's wonderful about them is that I often get a very characteristic tone of her voice from these little penciled marginal comments. Here's one from Amiel's journal. Now, Henri Frédéric Amiel was a Swiss don of the 19th century, and he wrote a very detailed diary called the Journal Intime, which contains many very serious reflections about all sorts of things. He was very much of a pessimistic vein and extremely self-pitying. In fact, if there was a kind of competition for the most self-pitying work of literature, I think Henri Frédéric Amiel's Journal Intime would come a very, very close second to Oscar Wilde's De Profundis. Here, for example, is an entry from 11th of December 1872, just to give you an example of his self-pity. a deep and dreamless sleep, and now I wake up to the grey, lowering, rainy sky which has kept us company for so long. The air is mild, the general outlook depressing. I think that it is partly the fault of my windows, which are not very clean, and contribute by their dimness to this gloomy aspect of the outer world. Rain and smoke have besmeared them. And in pencil, next to this, my aunt, in her habitual tone of amused exasperation, she has written in pencil, "Then why, in heaven's name, not clean them? Or get a servant to do it? Really," underlined. I have collected quite a few books about Eton, which was my school, not because I'm nostalgic about the place at all, really, but because it fascinates me as a phenomenon. Of course, I have M.R. James's Eton and Kings, his rather anodyne, but in a way strangely revealing memoir of Eton and Kings. But I suppose my favourite Eton book, because it's so strange, was written by a distant cousin of mine called Gilbert Bourne. And the title of it is Memories of an Eton Wet Bob of the 70s. Now, in Eton during the summer, you were either a wet bob or a dry bob. If you were a dry bob, you played cricket. If you were a wet bob, you went rowing on the river. And I was a wet bob myself, not because I was good at rowing, but because I was really terrible at cricket, and because if you were a wet bob, you could row on your own, in your own boat, and you wouldn't have to go in for any team sport. But Gilbert Bourne was a very keen rower, and this is an extremely boring book for anyone except somebody who is interested in rowing at Eton during the 1870s. But it does contain one very memorable observation, I think. He is recounting the visit of the revivalist preachers Moody and Sankey, who were the 1870s equivalent of Dr. Billy Graham, to Eton. And he says that one of the members of the Eton Rowing Eight got entangled and inspired by Moody and Sankey, and his rowing went off dreadfully. He was quite literally put off his stroke, and he had to be sacked from the Eton Eight. And he gives us this very memorable sentence: "But, as I have several times had occasion to observe, ecstatic religious emotionalism is destructive of good oarsmanship." And I think there you have an absolutely invaluable piece of advice. If you're going to go in for rowing, don't have anything to do with evangelical Christianity. I also have a considerable collection of autograph letters. Again, not so much collected as accumulated. A few were sent to me, but most of them were sent to my father or my mother, or indeed my wife, Joanna Dunham, the actress. Of course, the vast bulk of them were letters from my aunt, the writer Stella Gibbons. And this is a particularly interesting one. It was sent on March the 17th, 1931, to my mother, who was then a schoolgirl, and it announces really the engagement of my Aunt Stella to my uncle Alan. But it also contains a reference to Colcomfort Farm while it was being written. She says, "I'm going away by myself for 4 days at Easter to a place called Alfriston in Sussex." Incidentally, Sussex is where Colcomfort Farm is set, "where I hope I shall be able to write a lot of my novel Cold Comfort Farm. I have started it again, and it is going very well. It ought to be ready in about 3 months from now. I am enjoying writing it immensely. If only it amuses the British public as much as it is amusing me, it should do well. And of course it did, and it's never been out of print since its publication. But the interesting thing is that Longmans, to whom she sent it, Longmans had published her poetry, old Mr. Longmans said, this is an absurd book, I can't publish it, and I couldn't sell it even if I had to hawk it around on a wheelbarrow. But one of her patrons and admirers, Sir John Squire, who edited famous Mercury magazine, in which he published some of her poetry, persuaded old Mr. Longman to publish it, and of course it immediately won prizes and sold vast numbers of copies, so old Mr. Longman was proved very wrong. My parents, and I for that matter, knew the writer William Sansom very well. He often used to turn up at our house on New Year's Eve, always wearing a white suit and nearly always drunk. But he was always charming and very courteous. And here's a letter from him to them. I think this was before New Year's Eve, somewhere around Christmas. He says, "Dear Rennie and John, I'm overcome with shame. I turned your turkey over and took one of the oysters. It was a moment of lust. Surrounded by good things and good people, my horrible Etna erupted. May my sins be forgiven me. It tasted lovely, but I feel dreadful about it now. Love will." And there are two rather charming Edward Learish drawings at the end. And he says, "Here's a robin and another." This letter has actually been published in a collection of Ken Tynan's letters. It was sent to my wife Joanna. Ken Tynan was a great fan of my wife's acting, and he was, as you know, somebody with rather strange sexual tastes, and he'd seen her on television in a programme called Wicked Women, playing a Victorian murderess called Alice Rode, and Alice Rode had indulged in rather unpleasant sadomasochistic activities, and you saw her in the television programme limbering up to beat somebody with a whip or something, and Ken Tynan got very excited about it. Anyway, after that, he decided that he ought to get my wife Joanna to be in a pornographic film that he was devising. And he writes as follows, "The part that I would like you to look at is Sophie. As I also told you, there will be scenes and lines that will alarm you. Do not be alarmed. They are there for bargaining purposes, and I'm perfectly open to discussion, especially with an actress as right for the part as yourself." Well, Joanna never did the part. She was going to co-star with Robert Stevens in it, and I think Robert Stevens was equally unwilling to be in it. But she kept the script for many years and used to entertain people by reading extracts from it. Unfortunately, the script is now lost. I hope it'll turn up sometime. Every morning, if I have nothing worse to do, like paying bills or answering telephone calls, I sit down in here and start to write. I always change my desktop background regularly. At the moment I've got a picture by Walter Crane, rather a beautiful one, as you can see. It's of Persephone, the goddess Persephone, gathering daffodils in a Greek field, and it only occurred to me quite recently that actually it's a picture of a woman about to be raped, because Persephone was gathering flowers in a Greek meadow when she was seized by Pluto, the lord of the dead, and carried off to Hades and raped there, and her mother Demeter made a great fuss, and she was allowed to come back for 6 months and so on. So there she is, just about to be raped. And then I always turn to one of my stories that I'm writing. Rather like Kingsley Amis, I always like to have several stories, as he put it, on the go. I've got 3 at the moment, and a novel, and this is one of them. It's for an anthology called Terror Tales of the East Anglia, edited by Paul Finch. And at the moment, it's far from complete. It's called The Spooks of Selborough, which is a sort of punning title, because Selborough is a sort of version of Aldborough. And Aldborough is quite famous for being a place where ex-Secret Service people, MI6 and MI5, retire to. In other words, spooks. And this is about a retired spook in Selborough, who is in fact haunted by another spook. And I always look at the opening sentence and worry about the opening sentence, because opening sentences, and for that matter closing sentences, are very important. At the moment, the one I've written, I'm not quite sure about. It goes like this. Selborough in Suffolk is the sort of place to which most English people would like to retire, but as most of them at 65 are not the possessors of a sizable capital sum and an index-linked pension, they don't. It's all right, I think. It's a bit sedate, but it does at least establish the atmosphere and tell you something of what Selborough is going to be like. Of course, the great question is not where you get your ideas from, because that's obvious. You get them from wherever you get them from, but why do you write? Well, I think for me the key is in the name that Robert Aikman gave to all his stories, strange stories. I'd like to have a book of strange stories on all my collections. And I think it sums up, in fact, why I write, because I find the world strange and I see strange things in the world. Not perhaps as strange as the things that happen in my stories, I hope not, but nonetheless very strange. I think that writers' minds tend to work slightly different from other people's minds, in that they're rather like a lumber room, full of all kinds of rubbish and obscure facts and odd memories, and most people, I suppose, just very sensibly discard these, but writers keep them and somehow manage to make use of them. For example, the other day, I've always been fascinated by dictionaries. I love dictionaries, and I have a huge Greek lexicon, and I sometimes just pore through them. And right at the end of the Greek dictionary is a word, oak, which the dictionary defines as a magical incantation against fleas. I've always been fascinated by that. I mean, the ancient Greeks had a word literally for everything. They even had a word for to put under the armpits, maskalidzo, and a word for a female garlic boiler. But I've always liked the idea of oak, a magical incantation against fleas. And not so long ago I was writing something for one of Stephen Jones's composite novels called Zombie Apocalypse 2, and it concerned fleas, rather nasty fleas, and so I was able to put in this dictionary definition, this magical incantation, which might be useful against fleas. So these sort of useless bits of information do get used up. And in fact, for example, this story that I'm writing about the spooks of Selborough is a good example. I've always been fascinated by the fact that these Secret Service people retire to Aldborough, and it sort of nagged away at the back of my mind. And eventually I decided, yes, I must use it, and I have done. Her name is Flora, named after Flora Post, the heroine of Cold Comfort Farm.